Long before heroes sailed the wine-dark sea, before mortals whispered prayers to distant Olympus, before the first ship carved its path through untamed waters, there lived a goddess whose power would reshape the very definition of magic itself. She was born not in gleaming temples or cloud-wrapped mountains, but on an island where the boundaries between mortal and divine, between human and beast, between fate and free will blurred like mist across morning waves. Her name was Circe, and her story begins not with glory, but with shame. To understand Circe, one must first understand the bloodline from which she emerged, a lineage so potent, so terrifying, that even the Olympians regarded it with cautious respect. Her father was Helios, the Titan god of the sun, whose chariot blazed across the sky each dawn with light so fierce it could blind mortals who dared look directly at his radiance. Helios was ancient, predating Zeus himself, a remnant of the old order when Titans ruled the cosmos. His power was absolute within his domain, yet even he could not escape the complicated web of divine politics and cosmic consequences that would shape his daughter's fate. Circe's mother was Perse, an Oceanid, one of the 3,000 daughters of the Titan Oceanus. Unlike the thunder-voiced gods of Olympus or the earth-shaking Titans, the Oceanids embodied the quiet, relentless power of water. They were goddesses of rivers, springs, and hidden depths. Perse carried within her the mystery of transformation, the understanding that water could shift from gentle stream to raging torrent, from life-giving rain to drowning flood. It was this duality, this capacity for change, that she passed to her daughter. But from the moment Circe drew her first breath, it was clear she did not belong. She was born among gods and goddesses whose beauty could stop time, whose voices rang like crystal bells, whose presence commanded immediate worship. Her siblings, Aeetes, Pasiphae, and Perses, each inherited the blazing confidence of their father, the magnetic allure that marked them as undeniably divine. They moved through the halls of Helios's palace like living flames, beautiful and terrible, and utterly certain of their place in the cosmos. Circe was different. Her voice did not sing with the melodic perfection expected of goddesses. It carried a mortal roughness, a quality that made other divinities wince when she spoke. Her appearance, while not ugly, lacked the transcendent radiance that marked true divine beauty. She was plain in a family of stars, awkward where they were graceful, quiet where they commanded attention. The other gods noticed. They whispered when she passed, their voices carrying just loud enough for her to hear. Strange, they murmured. So different from her siblings. Almost mortal, some dared to say, the word dripping with disdain. In the hierarchy of immortals, there was no greater insult. To be compared to mortals, fragile, temporary, powerless mortals, was to be marked as fundamentally lesser. Helios, proud and blazing, did not know what to make of his strange daughter. He had expected another child who would reflect his glory, who would shine as brightly as the sun itself. Instead, Circe seemed to absorb light rather than radiate it. She spent her time in the shadowed corners of the palace, in the gardens where herbs grew wild, in the tide pools where small creatures lived, lives the other gods never bothered to notice. Her siblings were no kinder. Aeetes, who would one day rule Colchis with an iron will, regarded her with barely concealed contempt. Pasiphae, beautiful and cruel, took particular pleasure in reminding Circe of her inadequacies. Only in solitude did Circe find peace, walking the beaches of her father's realm, watching the waves reshape the sand, observing how even the smallest creatures adapted, transformed, survived. It was during these lonely wanderings that Circe first discovered her gift. She noticed things others overlooked. How certain flowers could bring sleep or wakefulness. How roots and bark could heal or harm. How the blood of one creature mixed with the essence of another could create something entirely new. She learned by watching, by testing, by failing in private where no one could mock her. She developed an understanding of pharmaca, the art of potions, poisons, and transformations. But understanding and power were not the same thing. Not yet. The moment that would change everything came on an ordinary day, beneath an unremarkable sky, when Circe encountered a young fisherman named Glaukos. He was mortal, achingly, beautifully mortal, with sun-darkened skin and hands calloused from nets and oars. He had stumbled into the cove where Circe often walked alone, and when their eyes met, something shifted in her chest. It was not the grand passion of epic poetry, but something gentler and more dangerous: recognition. He looked at her without judgment, without comparison to her siblings, without the dismissive glance she had learned to expect from gods. He saw her. And she, who had spent her entire existence being overlooked, fell desperately in love. Glaukos told her stories of the mortal world, of fishing villages and market days, of festivals and families, of lives lived fully despite their brevity. He spoke of the sea with a reverence that matched her own, describing how it changed with each passing hour, how it could be gentle as a lullaby or violent as war. In his presence, Circe felt something she had never experienced in her father's palace: the possibility of belonging. But their meetings were brief, stolen moments between his fishing runs and Circe, consumed by a love she barely understood, wanted more. She wanted him to stay. She wanted him to be more than mortal, more than temporary. She wanted to transform him into something that could exist beside her forever. So she turned to the magic she had been quietly studying for years. In her father's gardens, she gathered herbs that glowed with subtle power. She mixed potions according to instincts that felt ancient, primal, as if the knowledge had been sleeping in her blood all along. And when Glaukos returned to the cove, she offered him a drink she promised would make him greater, stronger, worthy of immortal attention. He trusted her. He drank. And the transformation began. But magic, especially magic born from desperation and inexperience, rarely manifests as intended. Glaukos did not simply become immortal. His body twisted, reshaped itself according to the wild logic of pharmaca. His legs fused into a powerful tail covered in gleaming scales. His fingers webbed. His hair became like seaweed, flowing with an otherworldly grace. He became a sea god, beautiful in an alien, unsettling way. Circe watched in horror as her love transformed into something she no longer recognized. And when the change completed, when Glaukos rose from the water as a newly born deity, he looked at her not with gratitude but with wonder. Wonder directed at the nymph Scylla, who had been watching from the rocks, whose beauty was as effortless as Circe's was lacking. Glaukos, now immortal and free from his mortal limitations, fell instantly, completely in love with Scylla. He forgot Circe as if she had never existed. The pain of that rejection carved itself into Circe's soul like a blade. She had given everything: her secret knowledge, her carefully hoarded power, her fragile hope. And it meant nothing, worse than nothing. She had created the very circumstances of her own abandonment. But pain, especially divine pain, does not remain passive for long. Jealousy, bitter, burning jealousy, replaced her heartbreak. If Glaukos loved Scylla, then Circe would ensure that love brought only suffering. She returned to her hidden knowledge, but this time without hope, without love, without any gentle intention. She brewed a poison so potent that the very water surrounding it turned dark. She poured it into the pool where Scylla bathed. The nymph's screams echoed across the sea as her body betrayed her. 6 serpentine heads burst from her torso, each lined with rows of razor teeth. Tentacles replaced her legs. Her beauty twisted into a nightmare that would haunt sailors for generations. Scylla fled into the straits between rocks, becoming a monster that would devour anyone who ventured too close. And Circe watched it happen. She felt no satisfaction, only emptiness. The transformation of Scylla did not go unnoticed. Word spread among the gods, whispered first in shock, then in fear. A goddess, a minor goddess, a strange and overlooked daughter of Helios, possessed power that defied the natural order. She could transform the divine, reshape immortal flesh, turn beauty into horror with nothing more than herbs and will. Zeus himself took notice. The king of gods, who permitted countless cruelties and transformations when they served his purposes, recognized something dangerous in Circe's magic. It was not the wild power of titans, which could be defeated through superior strength. It was not the strategic brilliance of Athena, which could be outwitted with cleverness. Circe's power was something older, stranger, a magic rooted not in divine authority, but in deep understanding of the fundamental forces that shaped all living things. It was a power that could, theoretically, be used even against gods. Zeus made his judgment swiftly. Circe would be exiled, not imprisoned in Tartarus alongside the Titans, for her crime was not rebellion, not stripped of her divinity, for even Zeus recognized that her power was too deeply woven into her nature to be extracted. Instead, she would be banished to a distant island, isolated from both gods and mortals, left to exist in perpetual solitude as punishment for daring to use magic that unsettled the cosmic order. The island was called Aeia. It rose from the sea like a forgotten memory, wrapped in perpetual mist, surrounded by waters that seemed to swallow ships that ventured too close. Ancient forests covered its slopes. Caves wound deep into its heart, and at its center stood a palace, not the gleaming marble of Olympus, but something older, built from stone that predated the gods themselves. Helios did not protest his daughter's exile. Circe did not intervene. Her siblings regarded her departure with relief. And so Circe, carrying nothing but her knowledge and her grief, descended to the island that would become both her prison and her kingdom. The first years on Aeia passed in a silence so complete it felt like drowning. Circe walked beaches where no footprints remained after the tide. She climbed hills where only the wind spoke. She explored the palace's empty halls, her footsteps echoing like questions without answers. The island provided everything she needed to survive. Fruit trees heavy with strange, luminous produce, springs that ran clear and cold, caves that offered shelter from storms. But survival and living were not the same thing. She was alone in a way that even exile could not fully describe. Not merely separated from others, but erased from their consideration. The gods had cast her out and promptly forgotten her existence. To them, she had become what she had always felt like, invisible. But isolation, cruel as it was, became Circe's greatest teacher. With no one to judge her experiments, no one to mock her failures, no one to fear her power, she threw herself into the study of magic with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She transformed the island's creatures, not out of cruelty, but out of curiosity, out of the desperate need to understand the limits and possibilities of her gift. She learned which herbs strengthened transformations and which weakened them. She discovered how intent shaped outcome, how emotion colored magic, how the boundary between human and animal was far thinner than anyone imagined. She practiced until potions that once took days to brew could be prepared in hours. She refined her craft until a single gesture could reshape flesh, until her voice alone could command the wild logic of pharmaca. And slowly, imperceptibly, she became something the gods had never anticipated. She became powerful. Not the thunderous power of Zeus or the earth-shaking might of Poseidon, but something quieter and infinitely more precise. Circe's magic did not announce itself with lightning or earthquakes. It whispered. It slipped beneath defenses, It transformed the world not through force, but through fundamental change. The island itself responded to her growing mastery. Trees bent toward her when she passed. Flowers bloomed in patterns that reflected her mood. Even the mist surrounding Aiaia seemed to obey her unspoken commands, lifting when she wished for clarity, thickening when she desired privacy. But power without purpose is simply cruelty waiting for direction. And Circe's purpose crystallized the day the first ship appeared on her horizon. She watched from the cliffs as it approached, its sail bright against the grey sea. Her first instinct was joy. After years of solitude, the possibility of conversation, of companionship, of anything besides her own voice echoing through empty halls, she prepared a feast. She wove her finest robes. She waited at the palace entrance like a host greeting long-expected guests. The sailors who climbed the path to her palace were loud, rough-edged men who smelled of salt and sweat. They carried weapons loosely, casually, as if violence was simply another tool they used when convenient. And when they saw her, a woman alone, without guards or protection, their eyes gleamed with assumptions that made her stomach turn. They did not see a goddess. They saw prey. The captain spoke with false courtesy, asking for food and wine. His men spread through her hall without permission, touching her possessions, laughing at private jokes she wasn't meant to understand. One reached for her arm with fingers that gripped too tightly. Another made comments about her appearance that were meant to sound like compliments but felt like threats. And something inside Circe, something that had been quietly hardening since Glaukos, since Scylla, since exile, finally crystallized into cold, perfect clarity. She offered them wine. They drank eagerly, toasting to her beauty, to their luck, to the pleasures they anticipated. The transformation happened quickly. Their bodies shrank, twisted, reformed according to their truest natures. Coarse hair sprouted across their skin. Their hands became trotters. Their crude laughter turned to squeals. Within moments, the men who had entered her hall as sailors left it as swine. Circe felt no guilt as she watched them stumble in confusion, as she herded them into pens she had prepared long ago for just such an occasion. These men had approached her home with violence in their hearts, had seen a woman alone and assumed vulnerability. They had forgotten, or never learned, that vulnerability and powerlessness were not the same thing. She fed them scraps and watched them root in the mud. And she did not regret her magic, but she did not celebrate it either, for in transforming them, she had become something she swore she'd never be, exactly what the gods had feared. A goddess whose power made her dangerous, a woman whose isolation had taught her to see threats everywhere, a being who responded to attempted harm with transformations that were themselves a form of violence. The pattern repeated. More ships arrived. More men climbed the path to her palace with assumptions and expectations that revealed their character. Some came seeking hospitality and left as beasts. Others came seeking to conquer and found themselves rooting in pens alongside the pigs. A few approached with genuine respect and curiosity, and these Circe received as true guests, offering them food and conversation and safe passage when they chose to leave. She learned to read intentions in the way men held their weapons, in the way their eyes scanned her home, in the words they chose when first addressing her. She became adept at seeing past politeness to the hunger beneath, at recognizing the difference between need and entitlement. And her island filled with transformed men, each one a monument to her power and her isolation. Yet for all her strength, for all her mastery of magic, Circe could not transform the one thing she most wanted to change. Her loneliness. She spoke to her pigs sometimes, though they could not answer. She walked beaches where her footprints still vanished with each tide. She sat in her palace surrounded by luxury and beauty and absolute control, and she felt the weight of immortality pressing down like a stone on her chest. Gods were not meant for solitude. Even in punishment, Even in exile, the absence of connection carved hollow spaces that no amount of power could fill. And then, on a day when wind carried the salt smell of distant storms, a ship appeared that would change everything, not because it carried threatening men or seeking heroes, but because aboard it sailed a man whose story was already legend, whose name was spoken with reverence and fear in equal measure, whose journey had been blessed and cursed by gods more powerful than Circe could ever hope to be. His name was Odysseus. And his arrival would force Circe to confront the most dangerous transformation of all, the transformation of her own heart. The ship that approached Aiaia moved differently from those that came before. It carried itself with a weariness that spoke of long journeys and impossible trials. Its sail hung tattered, patched in multiple places. The men aboard moved with the exhausted precision of soldiers who had survived too much to waste energy on unnecessary motion. Circe watched from her cliffs as they anchored in her cove. She recognized immediately that these were no ordinary sailors. They carried their weapons with the practiced ease of men who had fought in actual war, not merely brawled in taverns. Their eyes scanned the island with tactical awareness rather than greedy anticipation. But most telling was the man who stood at the prow, his gaze sweeping across Aiaia with an expression that mixed caution, curiosity, and bone-deep exhaustion. Odysseus. Even from a distance, Circe could feel the weight of story clinging to him like a second skin. This was a man shaped by gods and fate, blessed by Athena, cursed by Poseidon, trapped in a decade-long journey that should have taken mere months. He radiated intelligence, wariness, and something else. A profound longing for home that colored everything he did. She watched as he divided his men into two groups. Half would explore the island while he remained with the ship. A tactical decision that spoke to hard-won survival instincts. The group that climbed toward her palace was led by Eurylochus, a man whose suspicion radiated from him like heat from stone. Circe prepared her usual welcome, wine mixed with her most potent transformative pharmaca. If these men proved dangerous, they would join her other guests in the pens. If they proved honorable, she would send them away safely. It was a simple system, a just system, a system that had protected her for years. The men entered her hall with hands near their weapons, eyes scanning for threats, but they accepted her hospitality with the desperate gratitude of sailors who had endured unimaginable hardships. They ate her food, they drank her wine, and the transformation began. But Eurylochus, suspicious, careful Eurylochus, had not drunk. He watched in horror as his companions' bodies twisted and reformed, as human flesh became pig flesh, as the men he had sailed with for years became animals squealing in terror and confusion. He ran, back down the path, back to the ship, back to Odysseus with a story that would have sounded impossible if it hadn't been confirmed by the empty spaces where his companions should have been. Circe waited in her palace, expecting the pattern to continue, as it always did. The remaining men would either flee or attempt revenge, and either outcome would leave her alone once more, surrounded by her power and her isolation. But Odysseus did neither. Instead, he climbed the path alone. Hermes intercepted him first, the messenger god appearing in a shimmer of divine light on the trail between beach and palace. The god had been watching, amused, and slightly concerned by the mortal whose fate the Olympians had tangled themselves in so thoroughly. "She will offer you wine," Hermes said, "and in that wine will be magic strong enough to transform you as she transformed your men. But I bring you a gift." He held out a plant with a black root and white flower, moly, an herb proof against transformation magic. With it, Odysseus could drink Circe's wine and remain unchanged, protected by divine intervention from her power. "And then?" Odysseus asked. Hermes smiled. "Then you must draw your sword and make her swear by the river Styx to do you no harm. Only then will you be safe in her presence." Odysseus took the moly. He climbed the remaining path. He knocked on Circe's door with the calm poise of a man who had bargained with gods, who had faced cyclops and sirens and divine wrath, who had learned that courtesy could be as powerful a weapon as any bronze blade. Circe opened the door, expecting another mortal. Perhaps more cautious, perhaps more dangerous, but ultimately just another man whose intentions could be read in his eyes and his posture. Instead, she found herself facing someone who looked at her with something she hadn't encountered in years: genuine curiosity without judgment, wariness without fear, and an exhaustion so profound it made her own isolation feel almost comfortable by comparison. "I'm told," Odysseus said quietly, "that you have transformed my men into pigs." "I have. May I ask why?" The question caught her off guard. Not angry demands, not threats, simply a question, asked as if her answer actually mattered. "Because men who come to this island typically have intentions that do not end well for solitary goddesses," Circe said. Odysseus nodded slowly, understanding passing across his face like clouds across sun. "A fair assessment, given what the world teaches women, mortal or divine, about trust." He stepped inside at her invitation. He accepted the wine she offered. And when the transformation magic that should have reshaped him simply didn't, when he remained human and whole despite drinking deep, Circe felt something she had not experienced since before her exile. Uncertainty. She tried again, speaking the words of power that had never failed, weaving the magic that had transformed hundreds of men. Odysseus simply watched her, sympathy in his eyes rather than triumph. When her magic proved useless against whatever protection he carried, when she finally had to acknowledge that her greatest power was ineffective, Odysseus drew his sword. Circe stepped back, finally feeling something like fear. But he did not attack. He simply knelt, laying the blade flat in front of her, a gesture of both threat and trust. "Swear by the river Styx," he said, "that you will do me and my men no harm. Release those you have transformed. Show us hospitality without transformation, and I will sheathe this blade and accept your friendship rather than force your submission." It was a negotiation, not a conquest, a request, not a demand, an acknowledgement of her power, not a dismissal of it. And Circe, who had spent years turning men into beasts when they failed to see her as anything but victim or target, found herself face to face with a man who saw her as something else entirely, an equal. She swore the oath. The words bound her more completely than any cage, for a promise made on the river Styx could not be broken, even by gods. But as she spoke, she did not feel trapped. She felt strangely freed. "Your men will be restored," she said. And with a gesture, the transformations reversed. In the pens outside, squeals became shouts of confusion. Pig bodies reshaped into human forms. Men who had spent days or weeks as animals stumbled back into themselves. Horrified and grateful in equal measure, Odysseus sheathed his sword. "Thank you. Why didn't you simply kill me?" Circe asked. "Because I've learned that gods don't die easily. Violence rarely solves problems that negotiation might address. And because..." He paused, and something in his expression softened. "Because you looked at me like someone who understood what it meant to be trapped by circumstances beyond your control. And I have some experience with that feeling." In that moment, Circe understood that the man standing in her hall was fundamentally different from those who came before. Not because he was better or stronger or more moral, but because he carried his own burdens, his own isolation, his own losses, his own desperate longing for something that felt perpetually out of reach. "Stay," she heard herself say. "You and your men. Rest here. No transformations, no tricks, just hospitality." Odysseus studied her for a long moment, weighing the offer against years of divine manipulation and supernatural dangers. Finally, He nodded. We'll stay. For a time. That time stretched longer than either of them anticipated. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The exhausted sailors of Odysseus's crew found peace on Aeaea, their first true rest since leaving Troy, years before they ate without fear of poison. They slept without maintaining constant watch. They laughed with the genuine relief of men who had forgotten what safety felt like. And in the palace, Circe and Odysseus found something neither had expected: companionship. They talked, endlessly, deeply, with the desperate intensity of people who had been isolated too long. Odysseus told her of Troy, of the 10-year war, of cleverness and courage, and the slow erosion of honor when violence became routine. He spoke of his wife Penelope with a longing so profound it made Circe's chest ache, describing her intelligence, her faithfulness, her patient endurance. Circe told him of her exile, of the cruelty of gods who feared what they did not understand, of learning power in isolation, of the hollow victory of strength without connection. She spoke of Scylla with regret rather than pride, acknowledging the harm her jealousy had caused. They shared stories of transformation, his achieved through 10 years of war and impossible trials, hers through magic and exile and the slow accumulation of power. They recognized in each other the fundamental loneliness of beings who had been reshaped by circumstances beyond their control. And inevitably, companionship became something more, not the desperate, transformative love Circe had felt for Glaucus, that had been born from loneliness and hope for belonging. This was different, more aware, more complicated. They came together with full knowledge that their time was temporary, that Odysseus would eventually leave, that his heart belonged to a wife waiting in Ithaca. But for this moment, in this space outside normal time, they found comfort in each other. Circe felt her power shift during those months, not diminished, but refined. In Odysseus's presence, she learned that strength did not require constant vigilance, that power could coexist with vulnerability, that the walls she had built to protect herself had also imprisoned her. And Odysseus, for his part, found respite from the constant weight of being the clever hero, the responsible captain, the man chosen by Athena to endure impossible trials. With Circe, he could simply be human, tired, uncertain, sometimes weak. They existed together in a pocket of peace carved from the world's chaos. But peace, especially divine peace, was never meant to last. A year passed on Aeaea, then another. The men grew restless, remembering homes and families. The ships needed repairs, supplies needed replenishing. And Odysseus, despite the comfort he found in Circe's company, despite the warmth of her presence, could not escape the fundamental truth of his nature. He needed to go home. Circe saw it in his eyes before he spoke the words, the return of that deep longing, that pull toward Ithaca that even her magic could not sever. She had known from the beginning that this moment would come. She had prepared herself for it the way she prepared her potions, carefully, methodically, accepting that some outcomes were inevitable. "You're leaving," she said, not a question. "I must," she nodded, feeling something crack inside her chest but refusing to let it show. She had been left before. She had survived isolation before. She would survive it again, but this time she would do more than survive. She would help. "The journey to Ithaca is not simple," she told him. "Poseidon still hunts you. Obstacles still bar your path. But there is a way, a dangerous way, to learn what fate holds." She told him of the underworld, of how a living man might descend to speak with the dead, of how the prophet Tiresias could reveal the path home. It was knowledge she had learned in her years of isolation, studying the boundaries between worlds, understanding the liminal spaces where magic worked differently, Odysseus listened with the intensity of a man receiving instructions that might determine his survival. "And after?" he asked. "After I leave the underworld, what dangers wait?" So Circe told him everything of the sirens, whose song drove men mad with longing. Of Scylla, and here her voice faltered, acknowledging her own role in creating that monster of Charybdis, the whirlpool that swallowed ships whole, of Thrinacia, where Helios's sacred cattle grazed, and the catastrophic consequences of harming them. She gave him every tool she possessed, knowledge of safe passage, warnings of hidden dangers, strategies for survival. She armed him not with magic weapons, but with understanding, the most powerful gift she could offer. "Why help me so completely?" Odysseus asked. "You could keep me here. Your magic is strong enough to imprison you." Circe shook her head. "I have spent years transforming men who saw me only as something to be taken. I will not become what I despised by taking what is not freely given. Your heart belongs to Penelope. Your fate lies in Ithaca, and I—" She paused, gathering the strength to say what needed to be said. "I care for you enough to want your happiness, even if it means losing you." It was perhaps the most human statement she had ever made. The morning Odysseus and his men departed, Circe stood on the cliffs watching their ship grow small against the horizon. She felt the familiar weight of solitude settling back over her shoulders like a cloak she had temporarily removed. But it felt different now, lighter somehow, because she had made a choice. Not to trap or transform or take revenge, but to give freely, to help honestly, to love without possession. For the first time since her exile, she had acted not out of fear or anger or loneliness, but out of something approaching wisdom. The island fell quiet again. The palace halls echoed with absence. But Circe did not retreat into bitterness or isolation. Instead, she walked her island with new understanding. She tended her gardens, she practiced her magic, she waited, but she did not wait as a victim of circumstance. She waited as a goddess who had finally learned the difference between power and wisdom, between transformation of others and transformation of self. And though she did not know it then, her story was far from over. For the seeds planted during those years with Odysseus, both literal and metaphorical, would grow into something that would challenge her understanding of herself and her magic, in ways even exile never had. The child of a sorceress and a hero, born from the brief union of transformation and endurance, would eventually come to Aeaea, seeking answers. And Circe, who had spent so long isolated from the world, would find herself pulled back into the complex web of mortal affairs, divine politics, and the eternal question of what it means to wield power responsibly. But first, she had to complete the hardest transformation of all, learning to live with herself. The years after Odysseus departed passed in a strange rhythm, not the crushing loneliness of her early exile, but something more contemplative. Circe had changed during his stay, and the island seemed to recognize that change. The mists surrounding Aeaea lifted slightly, as if acknowledging she no longer needed quite so much isolation. Ships still arrived occasionally, but fewer than before, and those that did found a goddess who had learned discernment. She no longer transformed men simply for approaching with assumptions. Instead, she tested them, sometimes with magic, sometimes with conversation, sometimes simply by watching how they treated her servants, her animals, the island itself. Those who proved dangerous still found themselves rooting in pens. But those who came with respect found a powerful ally, a source of knowledge and hospitality that could sustain them for the next leg of their journeys. Circe had become something new, a liminal goddess, existing between worlds, between mortal and divine, between revenge and mercy. But the universe, which loves nothing more than testing those who have found peace, was not finished with her story. The child came first as rumor, whispers carried by traveling sailors, stories told in distant ports about a young man who claimed to be the son of Odysseus. Not by Penelope, his faithful wife, but by the witch of Aea. Some versions painted him as a monster, others as a hero in waiting. All agreed that he existed somewhere in the world, growing to adulthood with divine blood and human ambition mixed in his veins. Circe heard these stories with complicated emotions she had never learned to name. She had not told Odysseus of the pregnancy before he left, knowing that the burden of another child, another tie, would only make his journey more painful. She had borne the son alone, raised him in the palace halls, taught him magic and wisdom in equal measure. His name was Telegonus. He inherited his father's cleverness and his mother's power, combined in ways that made him both remarkable and restless. As he grew, he demanded stories of Odysseus, tales of Troy and the journey home, of cleverness and courage. Circe told him everything, watching her son's eyes light with admiration for the father he had never met. And she knew, long before he voiced it, that one day he would leave Aea searching for the man whose absence shaped him. "You cannot stop me," Telegonus said when he finally announced his intention. He stood before her, no longer a boy, but a young man hardened by training and eager for purpose. "I need to meet him. I need to know if the stories are true." Circe looked at her son and saw echoes of Odysseus in his posture, in the determined set of his jaw, in the way he approached challenges as puzzles to be solved rather than obstacles to be overcome. But she also saw herself, the hunger for belonging, the desire to prove worthiness, the desperate hope that family might offer answers to questions he did not know how to ask. "I know I cannot stop you," she said quietly, "but I can prepare you." She gave him weapons blessed with her magic. She taught him protective spells. She warned him of the dangers he might face. And most importantly, she told him the truth about his father. Not just the hero of legend, but the complicated, exhausted, deeply human man who had spent 2 years on Aea before the pull of home became irresistible. "He is not perfect," she said. "He is clever and kind, and sometimes ruthless when necessity demands it. He carries his own burdens, and his heart belongs to a wife and son who waited for him. Do not expect him to welcome you as you hope." "But you loved him," Telegonus said. "I did," Circe acknowledged, in the way 2 isolated souls recognize each other. But love does not create obligation, and understanding does not guarantee welcome. Go if you must, but go with realistic expectations. Telegonus left Aea on a ship provisioned with his mother's magic, crewed by men loyal to her, carrying a spear tipped with the poisonous spine of a stingray. A weapon she had crafted herself, powerful enough to harm even those protected by divine favor. She watched him sail away, and for the second time in her long life, felt the particular ache of loving someone enough to let them seek their own fate. She did not expect what came next. The news arrived months later, carried by Hermes, who appeared in her hall with an expression mixing pity and inevitability. The look gods wore when mortal tragedy unfolded, according to patterns older than Olympus itself. "Your son reached Ithaca," Hermes said gently. But Odysseus did not recognize him, saw only a raider threatening his kingdom. They fought. Circe felt ice settle in her chest. And the spear you gave Telegonus found its mark. Odysseus is dead, killed by the son he never knew he had, using a weapon crafted by the only goddess he ever loved besides Athena. The irony of it was so perfect, so cruel, that Circe almost laughed. Almost. Odysseus, who had survived 10 years of war and 10 years of supernatural trials, who had outwitted Cyclops and resisted sirens, who had journeyed to the underworld itself and returned, killed in his own kingdom by his own son, using magic created by a goddess who had tried to protect them both. Fate, it seemed, had a sense of humor as bitter as any poison. "Where is Telegonus now?" she asked, distraught, devastated. He brought Odysseus's body back to Ithaca, confessed everything to Penelope and Telemachus. "The situation is—" Hermes paused, searching for the right word. "Complex." Circe stood motionless, processing information that should have broken her, but instead simply added another layer to the complicated sediment of her existence. She had loved Odysseus. She had let him go. She had raised his son in his absence. And now both father and son carried wounds that her magic, for all its power, could not heal. "Penelope wishes to speak with you," Hermes continued, "and Athena has decreed that you are to come to Ithaca. This situation requires resolution that only you can provide. It was not a request." So Circe returned to the mortal world for the first time since her exile, sailing to Ithaca with Hermes as her guide. The island was smaller than she expected, humbler than the grand kingdom she had imagined. But it radiated the same exhausted resilience she had seen in Odysseus. A place that had endured too much and survived through stubbornness rather than strength. The palace where she was received felt heavy with grief. Penelope sat on a throne that seemed to swallow her, a woman whose legendary patience had finally brought her husband home, only to lose him to fate's final cruelty. Beside her stood Telemachus, Odysseus's legitimate son, a young man whose resemblance to his father was so striking it made Circe's breath catch. And across from them, head bowed in shame and grief, sat Telegonus. The reunion was not what any of them expected. Penelope looked at Circe, not with hatred, but with exhausted understanding. Two women who had loved the same man, both shaped by his absence, both changed by his presence, now forced to navigate the aftermath of his death together. "He spoke of you," Penelope said quietly, "in the years after his return, not with longing, but with respect. He said you taught him that transformation could be gentle, that power could coexist with compassion." "He taught me similar lessons," Circe replied. Silence fell, heavy and complicated. It was Athena who finally spoke, appearing in a shimmer of divine presence. The goddess of wisdom regarded the assembled mortals and immortals with eyes that saw patterns within patterns, strategies within tragedies. "Odysseus's death cannot be undone," Athena said. "But the threads of this story need not end in mutual destruction. Telegonus killed his father unknowingly. Penelope has lost her husband. Telemachus has lost his father a second time. And Circe—" The goddess turned to her. "You have spent centuries isolated, punished for crimes born of inexperience and pain. Perhaps it is time for different endings." "What do you propose?" Circe asked, wary of divine solutions that typically served gods rather than those affected. "Telegonus cannot remain in Ithaca," Athena said. "The guilt would destroy him, and his presence would be a constant reminder of tragedy. But neither should he be punished for an accident orchestrated by fate itself." She turned to Penelope. "And you, faithful Penelope, have spent your entire adult life waiting, enduring, surviving. Perhaps you too deserve something beyond grief and memory." The goddess was suggesting something radical, something that defied normal mortal understanding. That the survivors of Odysseus's death might find peace not in perpetual mourning, but in unexpected connections forged through shared loss. Over the following weeks, a strange household formed. Telegonus, racked with guilt, found unexpected comfort in Penelope's presence. She did not blame him. How could she, when fate had orchestrated the tragedy so perfectly? Instead, she saw in him echoes of the man she had loved, combined with a gentleness Odysseus had sometimes lacked. Telemachus, meanwhile, was drawn to Circe, not romantically, but as someone who understood transformation, who could teach him that identity was not fixed, but something that could be deliberately shaped. And Circe, watching these complicated relationships form, realized that she had finally stumbled into something she had sought her entire existence. A family, strange and broken and held together by shared loss rather than blood, but family nonetheless. When Athena appeared again, months later, she found them eating together, talking quietly, building something new from the ruins of tragedy. "I have spoken with Zeus," the goddess announced. "Circe, your exile is ended. You may return to Aea. You may return to Olympus. Or," she paused meaningfully, "you may choose differently." "What do you mean?" Circe asked. "You have lived as a goddess isolated from gods and mortals alike," Athena said. "But perhaps there is another way. You could remain here, in the mortal world, connected to these people who have become important to you. You could choose mortality, a limited life, but one lived, fully present, rather than stretching into endless isolation." It was an offer rarely extended to immortals, a chance to trade eternal existence for something briefer, but potentially more meaningful. Circe looked at Telegonus, her son, who had finally stopped carrying his guilt like armor. She looked at Penelope, who had shown her that patience and strength were not opposites. She looked at Telemachus, who reminded her that teaching was its own form of magic. And she thought about Iaia, about the palace halls that echoed with centuries of loneliness, about the pigs rooting in pens who represented years of defensive isolation. "I choose mortality," she said. Athena smiled, a rare expression of genuine approval. "Then it is done." The transformation was nothing like the violent reshaping Circe had inflicted on others. Instead, it was gentle, almost imperceptible. She felt the weight of immortality lift from her shoulders like a cloak, removed after wearing it so long she had forgotten its heaviness. Time, which had once stretched endlessly ahead, suddenly possessed boundaries, shape, meaning. She would age now. Slowly perhaps, but truly. She would experience the passage of seasons not as an immortal goddess marking endless cycles, but as a woman watching her life unfold toward its inevitable conclusion. It terrified her. It exhilarated her. It felt like coming home. The years that followed were quieter than any Circe had known, but they were rich with the small, profound moments that make mortal life precious. She taught Telemachus herbalism and magic. She listened to Penelope's stories of the 20 years spent weaving and waiting. She watched Telegonus slowly forgive himself, slowly build a life defined by more than one terrible accident. Some versions of the story say that Telegonus and Penelope eventually married, finding comfort in each other's understanding of loss. Others claim that Circe and Telemachus formed a bond that transcended grief. The truth, as always, was more complicated. A household bound by chosen connection rather than romantic love, by mutual respect rather than passion. Circe learned what it meant to be human in ways she had never understood during her immortal existence. She felt hunger that actual food satisfied. She experienced exhaustion that sleep actually healed. She watched her reflection change subtly year by year, lines appearing around her eyes, silver threading through her hair, and she discovered that transformation, the magic she had wielded for centuries, was not something that required potions or spells. It happened naturally, inevitably, to everyone who lived long enough to let experience reshape them. Her magic did not disappear entirely. Even as a mortal, she retained knowledge, skill, understanding, but it became a tool rather than a weapon, something she used to heal rather than harm, to help rather than punish. She tended gardens that grew medicinal herbs. She taught local healers the properties of plants. She delivered babies and closed the eyes of the dying. She lived not as a goddess among mortals, but as a woman among other women, connected to community in ways her immortal isolation had never allowed. And when she was old, truly old, with hands that trembled and breath that came short, she sat in the garden of the small house she had built on Ithaca's coast and reflected on the strange arc of her existence. She had been born a goddess and rejected by gods. She had been exiled and learned power in isolation. She had transformed men and been transformed by love. She had raised a son and watched him accidentally kill his father. She had been offered redemption and chosen mortality. It was not the story she would have written for herself, but it was, she realized, exactly the story she needed. Telegonus sat with her in her final days, holding her mortal hand with his half-divine one. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Giving up immortality?" Circe smiled, the expression crinkling her aged face in ways that felt earned rather than inflicted. "I spent centuries trying to control transformation," she said, "trying to reshape the world and everyone in it according to my will. But the most important transformation was the one I finally allowed to happen to myself." What transformation was that? Learning that power without connection is just loneliness with better tools. Learning that justice without mercy is simply cruelty with better justification. Learning that the magic I sought my entire existence, the magic of belonging, was never something I could brew in a potion or force with a spell. It was something I had to choose, and something others had to choose to give me. She looked at her son, at the man he had become, despite the tragedy that marked his entrance into his father's world. "You gave it to me. Penelope gave it to me. Telemachus gave it to me. And in accepting it, I finally became what I always wanted to be. Not the most powerful goddess, but simply whole." Telegonus's eyes filled with tears. "I love you, Mother." "I know," Circe said, "and I love you. That's a better magic than anything I ever learned on Aeaea." When Circe died, the island of Ithaca marked her passing with genuine grief. Not the fearful respect mortals offered distant gods, but the honest sorrow people feel when someone who improved their lives is gone. The healers she had taught lit candles. The mothers whose children she had delivered wept. The community she had quietly served for decades mourned her as one of their own. Hermes appeared to guide her shade to the underworld, a courtesy extended to few mortals, but owed to the goddess she had been. "Ready?" the messenger god asked gently. Circe took one last look at the world of sunlight and breath, at the island where she had finally learned to be more than her power, more than her exile, more than her pain. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready. The journey to the underworld was familiar from her stories, but strange to experience. She crossed the river Styx, paid Charon his toll, walked past Cerberus, who lowered his heads in recognition, for even in death she carried the memory of divinity. And when she reached the judgment hall where Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus presided, she found someone waiting for her. Odysseus stood in the shadowed hall, looking exactly as he had when he left Aeaea all those mortal lifetimes ago. He smiled, that complicated, clever smile she remembered so well. "Hello, Circe." "Hello, Odysseus. I heard you chose mortality," he said. "Heard you spent your final years on Ithaca. Heard you found peace." "I did, and you. Have you found peace here?" "More than I expected," he admitted. "Though I missed many things, many people." He paused. "You helped me once. When I was lost and exhausted, I never thanked you properly." "You did," Circe said. "You saw me, really saw me, not as the goddess who transformed men or the witch of Aeaea, but as someone who was just as lost as you were. That was thanks enough." They stood together in comfortable silence, two souls who had shared something profound and complicated, who had shaped each other's stories in ways both beautiful and tragic. Finally, Odysseus gestured toward the Elysian fields. "Walk with me. I can show you the parts of the underworld that aren't too terrible." There's even a garden, believe it or not. Persephone tends it. Circe laughed, genuine, surprised laughter. A garden in the land of the dead. How appropriate for me. They walked together into the eternal twilight of the Elysian fields, where heroes and honored dead spent their afterlife in peaceful reflection. And there, finally free from the complications of the living world, Circe found the last transformation she needed, not from goddess to mortal, not from isolated to connected, but from someone defined by what had been done to her, to someone defined by what she had chosen to become. And so ends the story of Circe, the goddess who learned that true magic was not found in transformation of others, but in the courage to allow oneself to be transformed, from the rejected daughter of Helios to the feared witch of Aeaea, from the isolated goddess to the mortal woman who chose connection over power. Her journey reminds us that we are not defined by our origins or our circumstances, but by the choices we make when faced with impossible options. She wielded power that could reshape flesh and bend wills, yet her greatest act of magic was choosing vulnerability over invincibility, mortality over eternity, love over loneliness. In the end, the goddess who had spent centuries turning men into beasts discovered that the most profound transformation of all was learning to be fully, completely, courageously human. Her story whispers across the ages that isolation is not strength, that power without purpose is merely cruelty, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is allow ourselves to be changed by the connections we forge and the love we dare to accept. Circe, who began her existence overlooked and ended it honored, teaches us that redemption is always possible, that wisdom can be learned even by immortals, and that the truest magic lies not in controlling the world around us, but in finally learning to belong within it.